First, I hold my hands out like they're on a steering wheel. Then I look over my shoulder. 1, okay, cool guy. 2, 3 times. Next, I put it in reverse. Meep, meep, meep. Then I take it up and down, up and down. And that, kiddos, is called the forklift.
Dance like a dad. It's a great way to make a moment with your kids.
Now that's dancing. Sure beats flossing.
Visit fatherhood.gov. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
Washington, D.C. symbolizes our nation's many liberties, including the freedom to vote. But in a city divided by politics, there is only one campaign slogan that has had unanimous appeal for half a century.
Hail to the Redskins! Hail victory! Braves on the warpath! Fight for old D.C. Run or pass and score, we want a lot more. Beat 'em, swamp 'em, touch them, let the points soar. Fight on, till you have won. Sons of Washington, rock, rock, rock!
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, gang, let's get this show on the road. How are you? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this is, of course, Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that we do for you each and every week. Into our investigations into what used to be in professional sports. And as longtime listeners of this show will know, we do not shy away from current events. Once it hits our radar, we talk about things like the XFL, the AAF, and these are timely as today's headlines. And if they fit into this genre we call forgotten sports, we are more than happy to literally and figuratively this week tackle it. And as you heard in that, I think now cringeworthy clip from 1982, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the now NFL Washington franchise, formerly known as, and hence the qualification, and importantly for this conversation this week, the Washington Redskins. And I'm going to be try to be very sensitive and not use or overuse that nickname too much in this conversation with our guest this week, Professor Rich King of Columbia College here in Chicago, an anthropologist by trade. We're going to get into the issues around why that nickname of the NFL franchise in Washington is no longer. I think there is a bunch of people out there who kind of don't understand why all of a sudden, seemingly, this nickname is now no longer. But as we'll learn more in this conversation with Professor King in a few moments, this is not a new issue. It's not a new issue with the Washington franchise. It's not a new issue with sports franchises, both pro and collegiate and high school, with the appropriation of Indian/Native American/indigenous people nicknames. It is not new even beyond the Native American and indigenous people communities either, as things like Black Lives Matter and other groups of people in this country and broadly have been not only erroneously appropriated, but has culturally become untenable and frankly not evolved and insensitive. And I think it's lost on a lot of people, especially as generations move onward. And we get into some of the reasons as to why the nickname in Washington persisted for so long. After a while, it sort of papers over some of the ugly truths as to why those nicknames were brought about in the first place and what they refer to. People become ignorant over time, over generations. They just know it as a nickname and colors and in a way to celebrate a team. And look, a lot of what we do on this show, frivolous as it may be sometimes, is we go back to not only just not forgetting about things, but understanding why those things became forgotten. Some of them are silly. Some of them are humorous. Some of them are actually very substantial and very important and very, shall we say, uncomfortable. And that's kind of the tone that we sort of get into this. And I'm not trying to be preachy here, but this is a very relevant conversation as we get into kind of why the new NFL understanding in Washington will now be bereft of the old nickname that has been part of the NFL landscape for 60 some odd years. And it's an important conversation. And as they say in sort of 1980s television sitcom promotional language, a very special episode of Good Seats Still Available. This week with our special guest, Professor Rich King, as we talk about the Washington Redskins, and it's probably the last time I'm going to use it by name, why the nickname, why it's leaving, and the background behind it. And the book that Rich wrote about 4 years ago, just again to show you that this is not an immediately new issue. It's been one that's been percolating for years, specifically with this team, but just generally in pro and collegiate and high school sports. The book is called Redskins, Insult and Brand. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. And even if you don't consider yourself a culturally hip, an anthropologist, you're not interested in any of these issues, you're just here for the sports fandom, I encourage you to listen very carefully to this episode. You'll find it enjoyable, actually. You also learn a lot. And I think it's very important. It'll open your eyes as to the situation at hand, not only with the Washington team, but Native American appropriation of nicknames and others and beyond in this, frankly, rather unique or maybe not unique moment in time in our nation's history. And it's a conversation that I think is important. And I encourage you to listen to all of it with an open mind and understanding, because I think you will learn a lot, as I did, coming up in just a few moments. We want to thank, before we do so, our sponsor this week is sportshistorycollectibles.com. Our pal Dean Mitchell in San Diego goes way out of his way to create a well-lit and a tremendously designed site that is, I like to call, a better version of eBay when it comes to all things historical in the realm of sports history and memorabilia. All kinds of sports, not just football. Will you find Washington NFL franchise previously named stuff there too? Yes, you will. You will find a whole host of other NFL and AFL and XFL, both versions, and USFL and whatever other football leagues, but not just football. All the sports, whether they be in teams that are no longer with us, leagues that are no longer with us, events that came and went, like things like the Tour de Trump that we've talked about, or the old Ontario Motor Speedway, et cetera. All kinds of stuff there, all kinds of memories, and more inventory coming there all by the week as Dean and his pals stumble across and or find treasure troves and collections, garage sales. And there's a ton of stuff that's out there sitting sort of hidden away that doesn't make it to eBay. And look, you get a better sense of what you're buying at sportshistorycollectibles.com, because Dean goes out of his way to photograph 6 ways to Sunday, all of the items, so you know with confidence what you're going to be getting. The prices are reasonable, and the stories behind them are also there too. It gives you some context. And again, it's sportshistorycollectibles.com. Bookmark it early, visit there often, and of course, once you stumble across something or some things that you just can't live without, make sure that you use the promo code GOODSEATS and get 15% off all of your purchases. Again, sportshistorycollectibles.com, promo code GOODSEATS, and you will enjoy, courtesy of us and Dean, 15% off all of your purchases. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, sportshistorycollectibles.com. And of course, thank you for not only continuing to listen to this show, but in particular, this conversation now upcoming with our guest this week, Rich King, as we talk about the origins and the future, I guess, of this Washington NFL franchise, and the origins, frankly, of why it was even a nickname in the first place and why it's an issue to remove it and to move on and move forward. Here's our conversation about that situation. Please listen carefully. You will hopefully enjoy it and learn as I did. Please enjoy. So obviously this is going to be an interesting topic. As you know, a lot of the zeitgeist of this show over the last number of years has been kind of around just all things around teams and leagues and related that are no longer with us. And some of those are long historical looks back, into the 1800s when certain teams in baseball sort of came and went. But a lot of them are also increasingly current, right? We've had a lot of conversations about the coming and going of spring football leagues like the XFL for the second time, et cetera. So anything that's timely and topical that sort of, that we can squint hard and sort of relate to things that are gone or now removed from sort of the sports world. But this is obviously a different tact, and I'll try to be as smart and intelligent as possible about it. But before we sort of get into it, maybe you can enlighten our audience a little bit into your background just generally to kind of set the table as to your expertise, and we'll sort of get into the story of the Washington football team's, shall we say, previous name along the way.
Sure. I have a PhD in anthropology from the University of Illinois, which is really where my interest in this subject generally began. And by that I mean both the larger question of how Americans use and understand Native Americans and Native American imagery, and the more specific issue of Native American mascots, why we have them, why people are upset about them, why people defend them in such passionate ways. And that interest has led me to write numerous articles, edit one book, and write two other books that deal with questions of mascots and representation. And the most recent one is on the Washington football team.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting background. So literally, you are professionally qualified, shall we say? So as we'll put that to the audience to go deep on some of these issues that a lot of what we focus on can tend to be sort of in the trivial or the comical, right? But we also get into some very strong gravitas related issues, and this is absolutely one of them. But I think that's helpful. And a couple of quick side notes. My wife is an alum of Illinois, a lot of friends. I live in the Chicago area. And maybe we could sort of kind of start there, because maybe you can give a little bit of background specifically there. Maybe it's also a little bit of how you became exposed, because for those outside of the Chicago area or Illinois or the Midwest, this is actually a pretty good primer, because the mascot of the Fightin' Illini is absolutely germane to kind of what we're going to get into with the Washington football team.
It is. So I started at Illinois in '92, and I really didn't know anything about the mascot. And in fact, like a lot of people in my generation, I was a Boy Scout. I was an Order of the Arrow. I grew up in Kansas City, so the local football team had my passionate allegiance, and was also had Indian connection to Indian mascots and mascotting. And so I never really had thought too much about Native American mascots. And as a parting gift, as my wife and I were getting ready to move to Illinois, someone gave us a welcome mat, and it said on it, Illinois, where the fun is, on the right side, and on the left side,
well, first, I could debate that, but that's another issue. Go ahead.
Yeah. On the left side was this caricature of what was purported to be an American Indian with a feather sticking out of his head and a very large nose. And it was at that moment I first sort of realized, whoa, there's something really deep going on here, and something really problematic. And when I got to Champaign-Urbana, it was really inescapable for me to think about it, right? Because as an anthropologist, one of the things that we want to do is we want to take things that are familiar and things that people take for granted and figure out what's going on there. And in the early 90s in Champaign-Urbana, Nobody really thought too much about the chief. And when they thought about the chief, they thought about a connection to a school, game day, and really positive kinds of things. And I happened to be attending at the moment that Charlene Tears and others were really beginning to push back against the mascot and say, hey, this thing that you think is so great is actually really disturbing, offensive, and hurtful, and we'd like it to go away. And it wouldn't go away really for another about 15 years, and there are still people connected to the school who want Chief Illiniwek to come back.
Yeah, and to sort of underline some of that, right? So literally a chief and center attraction for many years historically in the halftime football games presentation, right, where there's sort of a whole dance and a whole sort of kind of thing. And I think it's lost on a lot of people, especially those who are not familiar with or related to the Native American story or history or people from those communities. I think most folks outside of those of that world kind of just look at it as a quote unquote ceremonial and or festive and or entertaining kind of thing. I guess I'm curious as to sort of your introduction to that pageantry, which is part of the Illinois collegiate lore and experience, and how that sort of was originally presented and your experience with that, and then how you framed it as you sort of got deeper into the situation you were part of.
Right. So one of the things that's really was really prominent in Champaign-Urbana at the time was the chief head, and anyone who's familiar with Illinois during this period will remember that the chief head was a artistic rendition of this large feathered headdress in the middle of a circle in orange and blue, and that was really everywhere in town. And I think my first introduction was actually going to a game and seeing this white student come onto the field to really the thunderous adulation of those in attendance at the game, and performing what were purported to be Indian dances, right? And I think that it's noteworthy to think about how the student dressed, right? I mean, the student was in buckskin regalia, has this beautiful Plains Indian headdress, is wearing face paint, and is doing these really intricate kinds of dances. And if you don't know any better, right, you think all of this is authentic and real, and perhaps even honorific, right? And over time, and listening to protesters and thinking about sort of the broader question of how is it that Americans put Native Americans on display? How do they tell stories about themselves through their representations of American Indians, that I began to see that actually the chief is a lot more complicated, right? And the history of the chief is really fascinating, and it's really amazing, right? I mean, you have in the early 20s a student who's in the band who proposes that they create this mascot. He's an Indian hobbyist, former Boy Scout, and Chief Illiniwek makes his first public appearance in 1926 in Philadelphia at a game between the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Illinois. And at halftime, the student dressed in regalia and a student dressed as William Penn smoke a peace pipe, right? And so there's very many different layers of storytelling and community making that are going on in that halftime performance. And really from there, right? All sorts of traditions get elaborated at the university around this figure, right? Which many people at Illinois will say it was never a mascot, right? It was always a symbol, right? It was always something bigger and better than just what the idea of mascot conveys.
Well, and there's also the derivatives, right? As you know, so even if, and this is a big if, right? There weren't any, shall we say, inappropriate intentions, right? And you mentioned the word honorific or whatever. Even if it's confused as that, right? Even after that, right? So we could put that on the side for a second. It once it gets sort of ingrained into sort of tradition and or generations of memories and nostalgia, I guess, right? It then, kind of loses its grounding, even if there was some to begin with, because it takes on other sort of concentric, environments and situations, right? Where it doesn't even, it gets out of control, so to speak, right? And I guess where I'm trying to get to is how do you think it sort of originated? Was it, or was it just tone deaf? And obviously there's the stereotypical presentation, right? You're perpetuating stereotypes, and maybe simplistically so, like that peace pipe thing, right? Which is kids stuff, right? Which is a very simplistic and maybe erroneous sort of situational a concept. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is the origins of it. How it almost feels like it might have been more ignorant in its setup than it was conscious. You know what I'm getting at? Maybe.
Yes, and I think we can look at it both in a tiny window and in a larger picture, right? And the tiny window is that in the first quarter, in the first quarter of the 20th century, white Americans were turning to their idea of Native Americans and Indianness to deal with some of the things, some sort of social and intellectual crises that they were having. Right, there was a sense that urbanization and modernization had alienated white Americans from their true selves, from the natural world, and maybe even were feminizing young men. Right, and so ideas about and images of Native Americans became really prominent in sort of organizing and driving forward movements to recapture or make great again white America, right? And so you have, for example, Boy Scouts, you have campfire girls, you have all sorts of camps and campgrounds that are directed at youth and socializing youth that are informed by these ideas. And it's not a surprise that you have young people who are socialized in this way. They go off to college, right? And there's really a big push around sports as a way to salvage and strengthen masculinity, right? And particularly in college, right? And so you see at this period all sorts of Native American mascots being chosen by high schools and colleges. So in a small frame, right, it makes sense as part of a broader kind of movement to address things that people were concerned about at the time. In a bigger frame, right, we need to see what happened at Illinois and really across the country during this period as part of a larger project that is really sort of creating America and American identity, right? One might argue that one of the central pillars of America's idea of itself comes through its capacity to capture and remake Indianness. Right? I mean, even before the country's a country, right? You have the Boston Tea Party. And how is it exactly that Americans express the rebelliousness that they express, the uniqueness of America as a nation, right? It's by dressing up as Indians and throwing British tea into the Boston Harbor, right? And we see all across the 19th century that playing Indian is really fundamental to how Americans can really sort of articulate to themselves and others what it means to be American, right? And I think it's through this playing Indian, this taking of Indianness and remaking it, that Americans not only sort of claim a space, by which I mean really both a cultural space and a geographic space, right? They not only sort of claim a space, but they create a sense of who they are. And so when we're debating American Indian mascots, right, the question isn't just is this image problematic, or is this dance something that shouldn't happen? It's really a bigger question about what does it mean to be American, and how do we tell stories about ourselves to ourselves, right? And Indianness has really been central to that.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important framing, because in essence, it's, for lack of a better term, it's cultural appropriation, right? And you know, that's very deep and true in terms of things like the Western, right, in pop culture, right, and the even the storytelling around Thanksgiving and all the sort of cartoon-ish imagery and or simplicity, I guess, of story. You know, and that just, again, I think it also then sort of radiates out, and where it gets, you know, tragic, right, is it wallpapers over quite a bit of history, right, including how this country has and hasn't accommodated the Native American people, right, with these things called reservations, and the constant sort of narrowing and underfunding, and you know, we can get political and about all of it, but you know, people of these generations kind of don't realize, right, that obviously this land was appropriated by explorers, right, and the Native American, that's why they're called Native Americans, were quote unquote here first, and it's a very tragic and still evolving process by which this country, 200 plus years old, has and hasn't dealt with the Native American population to a point where it's brings equality and opportunities and all of this. I mean, when you use the term and the structure of quote unquote reservations, right, it would seem that there's still quite a long way to go when it comes to the original inhabitants of this continent.
Right, and I think that one of the sort of important things to not miss, and when we think about mascots, is to say, well, it's just an image, right? Or it's just somebody dressed up in a headdress, because when we trivialize what's going on there, we miss the much larger issues, right? I mean, how Americans understand indigenous people is really central to how we treat them. And if, as is the case, we walk around with fictions and falsehoods, the way that we treat them is not going to be grounded in reality, right? And in fact, we might say that the stories that we have told to make ourselves feel better and to really erase the ugliness of the past that you refer to, right? And when we engage with mascots, it's really an opportunity to open up that history and to ideally come to terms with it in some kind of productive way.
All right, so let's use that as a helpful sort of context then to sort of get into, I mean, literally to literally this week, right, in history, right? We're in the midst of what seems to be, to certain groups of people, an all of a sudden issue, right? That's somehow seems to be manufactured. And again, I'm not saying I agree with this, but there's certainly people out there where all of a sudden the name of the Washington football franchise, the NFL team, is all of a sudden now not only off the board, but being questioned for all of its legacy. And I guess where I'd like to kind of go is, before we get specifically into the Washington situation, this is not the only team, right, at the pro level. And you alluded to colleges and high schools and stuff, right? It's another issue, but maybe you can expand a bit about this. The idea of using Native American logos and names and references, well-intentioned or otherwise, or ignorant, or both, is fairly common in the history of sports in this country, right? Including current teams in baseball and other places, which still use some of these brands, shall we say, where they are brands. So maybe a little bit of a walk through the sports team appropriations of these things, and maybe a little bit of an understanding of perhaps why this really isn't an acute issue. It's actually one that's been percolating for quite some time, but perhaps for other reasons now has its immediacy moment right now to make changes.
Right. So at the same moment that you have high schools and colleges choosing American Indian mascots, you have professional teams who are doing the same thing, right? So you have Cleveland, for example, who adopts the Indians in the second decade of the 20th century. Right? You have later on in the 30s, you have the Washington franchise takes the name that it takes when it's in Boston before it moves to Washington.
And by the way, Boston, they were founded as the Braves, ironically, right? So, and maybe not ironically, but
right, they were founded as the Braves, and then when Marshall buys the team, he changes the name, right? And I think it's very much about branding and having a distinct name, right? And I think it's important to recognize that in all of these cases, the mascot is not simply a way of identifying the team or a symbol around which the community comes together, which in both cases they are, but they're also highly profitable brands, right? And that's something that develops really, I think, in the last half or quarter of the 20th century, right? Is this branding becomes particularly important, right? And so I think it's important to note that at least part of the resistance to changing these symbols and practices has to do with how profitable they are. You can sell lots of.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. That's a very important point, right? Because now you're really injecting another tangential and systemic element to it. There's profitability here, right? Which he just augments and or doubles down on the, if you will, offensiveness and or inappropriateness, right? Because money now is being made off of these tenuous original mascots and logos.
Right. I mean, it's not an accident that some of the most valuable sports franchises in the United States, right, have Indian mascots and logos, and that their fans embrace them in a way that perpetuates some really historic and some really ugly kinds of stereotypes and images. And I think an important distinction that I want to make between professional and collegiate and high school mascots is the following, right? Until the DC team just recently dropped their name, no professional team at the highest level had made a change, right? And part of that must have to do with the profitability, right? So over the last 50 years, since Native Americans and others have said, hey, let's change this mascot, let's get rid of American Indian mascots, right? You've seen hundreds of high schools and dozens of colleges who've said, okay, we will do that, right? But we haven't seen professional teams, particularly at the highest level, eagerly embrace that, right? And so one of the questions is, we have to ask ourselves is, why is that, right? And I think part of it has to do with who are the stakeholders of these different entities and what kind of pressure can they bring to bear, right? And in local communities where you have Native students and in states where you have indigenous populations who are visible and present, right, you have a foundation for a political movement and vocal opposition. Oftentimes, at the professional level, teams opt to ignore or not listen to or sideline indigenous people because they're such a small percentage of the local community, or because they will say they don't represent all Native Americans. They're just a small set of disgruntled people, right? But I think that is a fundamental difference that's important to note and think about, right? Is how lack of a demographic and political presence impacts, how different entities have responded to the mascot controversy, right? It's also the case that you have regulatory boards and entities that govern schools, right? So the NCAA can step in and say, hey, we're going to prohibit championships going to schools, like playing the championships won't happen at schools that have the following kinds of mascots. Or state boards of education can say, you need to re-examine and or change these kinds of mascots. Nobody's doing that to the pros, right? And so it makes it difficult to bring pressure on them.
Yeah, so that's again another exceedingly interesting point, right? Because you've seen, say, the St. John's now Red Storm, or the Syracuse University now Orange, right, without the men part. But I think it's also interesting too. So that's an interesting distinction between why that and the pros. But it's also really important too to remember that also around the same time, right, the branding and the money behind those brands has seeped very deeply into the collegiate ranks as well, right? These are very powerful and remunerative brands too. So it's interesting how that maybe should and it maybe is overdue inform what the pure pros should and could be doing as well.
No, and I think that where there was resistance in the past around American Indian imagery, we are seeing. I think we're seeing, in part, a kind of engagement with a key contradiction of late 20th century American race and racism. Right, that is, we've operated for a long time with a kind of a black-white paradigm, right, in which there's been heightened awareness and sensitivity about appropriations of blackness and misrepresentations of blackness, right? And one sees in the 60s from the 60s forward, a whole series of changes and rebrandings that happen, right? It's not total, right? It's not all of a sudden Americans think in a very progressive way about the racial history that they have in black and white terms, right? But there's a shift, a sensitivity around blackness, right? At the same moment, we don't see that really happening quite the same way with American Indians and their historic experience, right? So even 2 months ago, when leagues and teams were making statements about how Black Lives Matter or how they take the issues of racism in sport seriously, right? At that time, for example, you had the DC franchise who is saying, right, we believe that, that Black Lives Matter. We're against racism, right? And lots of people rightly pointed out, well, if you're against racism, why don't you get rid of your racist logo? By the same token, recently the NHL had a big public demonstration against racism at, I think, the opening ceremony of a game between the Chicago team and the Edmonton Oilers, I believe. And lots of people pointed out this contradiction, right, between so you're anti-racist, but you embrace these problematic images and symbols, right? And I think that one of the things that the current moment may be pushing institutions and gatekeepers to do is actually confront some of these contradictions, right, and get beyond the superficial press releases that they've gotten away with for a long time.
I'm sorry. In other words, the current moments we're living in, right? Which I was watching a documentary on 1968 last night, and they're not new, right? The racial tension in this country, it just continues. Everything old is new again. It's never really, but it almost feels to me that what you're sort of suggesting is that it's okay in this case. Like we should open it up to all of racism, right? You could make the argument, as I will. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the Native American, the treatment of Native Americans in this country is almost, you could, in quotes, call it the original discrimination, right? Which even goes further back in this country's history to even that of the very long-standing and painful race issues in this country since the 1700s, right? So, but I think your point really here is that it's this moment in time that we're living in now is not only directly important to the African American experience and community, but frankly, it probably is a wise idea for us to think of racism in a more general way overall, and see where else in our various nooks and crannies of society we can now, once and for all, kind of address these problems, inclusive of that of the Black community.
Right, and I think it's a real opening for public conversations to happen, but they're not happening in a uniform way or with the same sort of depth. And so just to offer a contrast in how different professional teams are dealing with this moment. So the DC team changes its name, but it hasn't really done anything else, right? It hasn't had a real soul-searching or broader conversation about fan behavior or how fans...
It's been more politically corrected, reactionary at this point, right?
Right. And so it's just sort of like we changed the name. And then you have a team like the Chicago NHL team that says, if you think our mascot's problematic, you don't really understand it, which is very much an old school kind of response that one might have heard from DC a year or two ago, right? In which it's like, you don't understand our tradition. And if you understood our tradition, you wouldn't ask us to change it. And then you have a team like Kansas City, the NFL team in Kansas City, who's been much more proactive in the sense of they're actually thinking about what does it mean for our fans to come to games in headdresses or face paint? What does it mean for us to have this drum ceremony that we use to hype up the team? Do we feel comfortable with our fans doing the tomahawk chop, right? And I think that those conversations that the teams are having, if they can find their ways into broader communities, actually could be transformative, right? So I mean, if all you're going to do is erase the name and not deal with all of the deeper things that are there, like why the name was chosen or how it was possible for 80 plus years to use a racial slur and profit off of it, to ignore American Indians, right? If you're just going to erase the name, I think that's really sort of a dead end process that's not going to take us much further. But if there are these broader dialogues about what does it mean? What does it mean to wear a headdress, right? How's that connected up to cultural appropriation? how's that appropriation connected up to how we engage with Native Americans? What does actual respect for Native Americans look like? Right? Those are deeper kinds of questions, and I'm hopeful that that's something that sport media, sport communities can actually push forward. I mean, it's clear that what's going on in the NBA right at this moment is a recognition by a set of athletes that we have the power to call attention to social problems, right? Maybe they don't have the power to fix them, but they have the power to call attention to them and say, let's fix these, right? And so the next question is, what's the capacity of sport to actually drive positive social change?
So many other questions. Where can and where is the Native American community? I mean, marginalized as it has been over the history of this country. Okay, I'm just throwing that out there as I think an arguable fact, but it would seem to me that those teams and folks dealing now and grappling with a name or a logo and a quote unquote tradition would want to and should engage with representative voices from the Native American community to mutually feel their way through how these situations can change, evolve, be rectified. And arguably not necessarily just now, but it should have been over time. I guess the question in there is where have been and how engaged have been the Native American communities in these situations, and or have they been largely, I'm guessing, rebuffed by these pro and even collegiate situations?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of rebuffing. I mean, I think if one looks at the history of the DC football team, there's been a lot of effort to silence that community, to talk over it, to suggest that they're a minority, to use polling data, for example, to say, oh, most Native Americans are okay with this. These are just a bunch of complainers, right? To fight them in court to protect their copyrights, to find the most spurious, what I call in my book, pretendians, right? People who are pretending to be Native Americans as representatives of the broader American Indian community. And so I think that there's really a history of trying to further that marginalization, right? So you have this marginalization of Indigenous people, and then when Indigenous people try to claim equal rights and dignity and point out, hey, you're dehumanizing me, the effort of a lot of organizations has been to further that dehumanization by ignoring them, for example, or silencing them, or putting together committees to study things. I mean, one of the reasons that the Illinois Chief Line lasted so long at Illinois is they kept putting together committees to review what should be done. And the committees would come back and say, hey, we got people on both sides. We don't know what to do. Which is
kicking the can down the curb, right?
Exactly, right. And so it's sort of like we're trying to figure out a way to maintain the status quo without offending anyone. And that is always problematic. So, I mean, and I think it's noteworthy that DC really hasn't engaged with Indigenous people in a productive way, even now that they're making this change. Whereas you have other teams like Kansas City who actually has been working with Native groups and using those dialogues to think about what are the best practices in our stadium, and how should we, going forward, change in response to what you're telling us. There also are, some people might say, these are really problematic relationships, but there are relationships between tribes and universities in which the tribes endorse the use of the mascot, right? So Florida State is perhaps the most prominent of these, in which the Florida Seminole tribe has said, we accept, endorse, support your use of our name and image as your school mascot, right? And one might argue that that comes with certain political and economic benefits for the tribe, right? But it's important to note that those two sides have worked together, right, to find something agreeable. Never mind what the Oklahoma Seminole tribe says, because they're against it, but the Florida Seminoles have said this is cool. Something similar, a similar kind of thing has happened in Utah, in which the Ute Nation has said that the University of Utah is fine in how it's using the name and the imagery. And so we might say, wow, this is really problematic, and there's a lot of things here we'd like to dig deep on and think about in a deeper political way, but I think that those are noteworthy kinds of relationships.
So my question then, I guess, is, and I think you're sort of answering it, is there a way? I mean, it almost sounds like a framework, right? That's sort of being inelegantly created, right? You just mentioned two examples that could be maybe furthered and or solidified. Because the question I'm asking, I guess, is, can these situations truly be rectified? Right? I mean, is it? The names are just, is it completely, cut them cold turkey and figure out some other way and move on, or are there ways to? And you're mentioning the Atlanta Braves or the Cleveland Indians, or maybe perhaps could have been done in this Washington NFL team situation, or you're mentioning how the Chiefs have done it. I mean, is there a way? Is there a framework to make this situation better, or is it a let's just cut the crap and move on because this is just beyond offensive at this point? It seems like you're suggesting there could be and should be a framework here.
Well, so the framework that I just sort of explained with Florida State and Utah, I think, is very much the framework that the NCAA encouraged, right? In which the NCAA said indigenous mascots are okay if there's a tribal group that supports them, right? And so that set up a framework in which there is a kind of limited consultancy and sovereignty at play, right? In which Native voices matter in a particular sort of way. And one of the things that happened is this really sort of set off this process in places across the country, like Illinois and North Dakota, where administrators and alumni worked really hard to get tribal support that wasn't there, right? And we might say, well, great, then those mascots shouldn't exist. And that's one kind of framework. I would argue for a more proactive framework, right, in which teams and fan bases accept some responsibility, in which they're sort of accountable and engaged around the deeper issues, right? I mean, it would be wonderful, like in this fantasy world that I'm putting together here, if a professional franchise would actually say, you're right, having our fans come to games in headdresses and face paint and do the tomahawk chop is reflective of a deeper history of racism. And therefore, we're going to put aside this much money for anti-racist education. Or we're going to put aside this much money for scholarships for Native American students, right, in which there's actual recognition of history and legacy and some sort of really concrete practices to engage and reverse that, right? And while part of the framework really has to focus on indigenous people, it can't be disconnected from racism more generally, right? I mean, in some ways, there's a tension in Kansas City. Here you have Kansas City saying, okay, we're going to engage a little bit with this anti-Indian racism in the stands. And you wonder, well, how are you going to then engage with anti-black racism that's pervasive in the NFL? Right? It's just really built into professional football in the United States. Right? And on a deeper level, and this is, I think, one thing that's easy to miss when we think about Native American mascots is really on a deeper level, this is about white people, right? And that part of what has to happen, right, is white people need to really be schooled in how whiteness made mascots possible, right? And in the kind of entitlements that made it not only appropriate but enjoyable and profitable to use a racial slur to market a professional football team or to cover it in the media, right? And so I would say, in some ways, this is a white people problem, and these organizations need to be working, right, really taking leadership around issues of white entitlement and white racism.
Well, that's especially interesting because I'm going to circle on the Redskins just for a second as the team. And there it's the first time I actually said the name, and I've been trying very hard not to. But there you go. It just seems as a sports fan, it clicked into my head, and there's that educational process that needs to be further made more deep and understood. But the irony here, one of the biggest ironies here, is the founder of this Washington NFL franchise, right, was for many years sort of recognized, if you will, as being racist from the get-go, right? I'm going to say, proud of it, but he was, if it was ignorance or otherwise, right? But George Preston Marshall, not the most tolerant, he was probably the most resistant to integration in the NFL. There was to the point of having, I guess, what was sort of at the time known as sort of a gentleman's agreement. I mean, this is just an accentuator to the situation specifically in and around the Washington NFL franchise.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, here's a team that was the last to integrate in the NFL, and only really did so because of federal action to compel them to do so. That was protested when they did so by the American Nazi Party, who had placards outside of the stadium that said "Keep the Redskins white." Right, and I think that those two things go hand in hand, right? Anti-black racism and anti-Indian racism go together. They look very different, in part because of history, in part because of demographics, right? But they're really two sides of a coin. And if we wanted to go explore that really deeply, we would say, how is it we talk about black athletes versus white athletes, and how do we do different mascots for each of these racial groups? Well, I mean, why don't we have African American mascots? Right? It's just something really powerful about how Americans think about African Americans. Not that I want these all popping up, but I'm just saying that's something really deep. Right? And so, I think that Marshall really reveals that entanglement.
So specifically on this, on the Washington franchise, then I'm not going to. This is not the time to sort of talk about the Daniel Snyder era, but clearly this is a franchise that, and I've only learned recently. I grew up as a New York Giants fan, so I always hated the team for other reasons, right? But ignorant, right? At the time, I was just a fan of the team, and I just couldn't stand Washington, and that's just the way it was as a Giants fan, right? But now as an adult and understanding not only this moment in time, but just going back and understanding more around cultural history and all of it, right, is it almost makes me doubly and triply steamed. Because it would seem to me that with Marshall and his history, an innovator on a lot of different levels, yeah, but not blindly to this other very systemic racism issue. We just saw the statue of him removed just last 2 months ago, right? Because of this, if you will, moment in time. But why is it taking this moment in time, right? This is Shirley Povich was talking about this in his columns in the Washington Post. And many others were roundly criticizing him for his racist views and perhaps even the Native American treatment with this logo and nickname. It's curious to me as to why it's taken so long for this particular franchise situation, given all of that inglorious history.
Well, I think that there are a number of factors that play into why this particular franchise took so long to change. I mean, part of it has to do with cultural and historical illiteracy that many folks for and against the team walk around with, right? That we're not encouraged really to be critically engaged about history and about race, and because people don't have a language to think about it, they don't think about it. Right? I think that there's an odd way in which the team name, which is a racial slur, really in some ways also gets detached from that history. And it just becomes this floating brand. Right? And so when people think about the team, right, consciously they're not thinking about the slur, right? They're thinking about the team. And as you said, right, it's just part of how one thinks about the game, and it doesn't have these overtones. And when someone brings those overtones into the conversation, the problem isn't the team name. The problem is the person who's trying to make what people think of as apolitical political, even though sports is always political. Right? On another level, it's hard to change these names because people have sentimental attachments to them. I mean, the DC franchise and its name means something to people in terms of how they relate to their families and their family histories, the kinds of personal traditions that they had, a great memorable time that they had with their dad, a spectacular moment in their lives. Right? These are all sort of effective attachments that make it really hard for people to see this thing as bad. And then you bring in personal politics in a particular way, and people get really resistant. So if you say to someone, hey, your mascot's racist, you're in a sense saying, hey, you're a racist. And the worst thing that you can really almost say to someone in the current moment is you're a racist, right? And so suggesting that you're a morally flawed and socially failed person, right? Nobody wants to be called a racist, right? And so if that's the starting point of the conversation's not going to go very far. And I think that a lot of these features, profitability, sentimentality, tradition, and politics all played a role in why multiple owners have said, we're not changing the name, right? And, I don't know exactly what drove Daniel Snyder to say, we'll never change the name, and you can put that in all caps, right? But I think it really was a combination of factors, and not just the fact that he was a jerk or just was interested in money.
So I think that what you just said there is profound, right? Because and that this sort of goes into the heart of why I even started this little show 3+ years ago. Is it was somewhat trivial in that, but I was always fascinated for whatever reasons why teams and leagues sort of came and went, and sort of the histories around that, and a lot of it for me personally, and I've seen with the listeners of this show, tends to be not always, but tends to be around one of those sentimental attachment moments or times in one's life, right? For young American males, it tends to be, their preteen and adolescent years when they somehow attach themselves to this sports phenomenon, and usually the pro team or two. For me, it was this team called the North American Soccer League's New York Cosmos, right? That came and went, and that's just part of my upbringing. But to your point, right? If I'm a Washington D.C. area 11-year-old, say during the 70s, right? And I am become a football fan, and this NFL thing is really taken. I become attached to the team and its name and its logos and all that stuff. And as I get older, there's a hagiography around it, and I almost become recalcitrant or resistant to your point. Somebody maybe now with more knowledge and wisdom and understanding, questioning the origins of the name, right? And one then probably gets very defensive about that kind of accusation. And I think that's really kind of the gnarly realities of some of the stuff that we're talking about here, that team in particular and others generally.
No, I think that's exactly right. And one of the things that I began thinking about 15 years ago, I began thinking, in some ways, the mascot controversy was sort of a leading indicator for really how a lot of the quote unquote culture wars would play out in the coming decades, in the sense that the idea of changing something that people hold dear, that is central to their identity and to their story, is very threatening, and it puts people in a defensive posture, and it makes the change more difficult. Right, and I think that one of the I was going to say struggles, but maybe I'll frame it in a positive way. Right, one of the opportunities of the current moment, right, would be to say, right, how do we get out of this moment telling more common stories, right, having more shared vocabulary to talk about the world, and a deeper capacity to recognize right, where people are at and the histories that they live with and through. Right, and if we can find more common stories, right, I think we come out of this current moment much better. If we don't find common stories, right, I think we'll have more friction going forward.
All right, one more question, and then I'll let you promote, okay? Because this has been illuminating, to say the least, and I'm sure our audience is going to be appreciative of it too. I hope and believe such. Here's an interesting theory that I'll throw out there, and I maybe there's something to it and maybe not. Right? You're referencing obviously some of the business issues that sort of people push back on, right? And maybe that's why Snyder pushes back on the team name years ago, and because these are businesses, right? And perhaps even more so now than ever before, right? I mean, pro sports is really, we're talking about private equity now and multi-billion-dollar valuations, and the money's only gotten bigger, and the business has only gotten more substantial around what maybe a generation or two ago was more of a quaint kind of enterprise, right? I'm wondering, and this is probably born out of ignorance more than anything else, but it doesn't seem like it, maybe. If the Native American communities, especially those that are very active in the gaming industry, and there are lots of reasons as to how that has become an economic engine for certain tribes and the politics around that. I'm just wondering, though, in those situations, perhaps not only culturally, but economically, the Native American community, especially those exposed to the gaming industry and deep into it, might actually have, interestingly, some more solid leverage now, especially when you think about pro sports and now the advance in the United States, at least finally, perhaps, betting and gambling in and around sports. And maybe it's an imponderable at this point, but it feels to me like in those situations that maybe there's some not only cultural agreement, if you will, and understanding and mutual coordination, but maybe economically too, in a weird sort of backhanded way.
Right. I mean, I think that one of the social and economic drivers, often where Native communities and white communities come together, right? Is where there's a mutual shared interest, right? I mean, so if you think about Florida State, one might argue the reason why this works so well is you have a tribe that needs a certain political and economic needs, and you have a university and a state that needs this or thinks it needs this image, right? And they converge at a particular kind of place. And we might say, right, that in some ways that might be a different approach to thinking about politics and social issues, is to think, where is it exactly these interests converge, right? As opposed to having this binary of here's the Indian side, here's the white side, right? Where's the convergence, and how do you get there? And I would say part of how you get there has to be working through the histories and legacies, and really having dialogues, right, about those interests. And it takes a lot of time, right? I mean, there's a lot of built-up mistrust. There's a long history of outsiders coming in and just taking what they want. All right, so it will take a lot of time, right? But I think that there's something really positive that comes out of those engagements, and I'll leave you with one of those positives, right? Which is the relationship between the Spokane tribe of Indians and the Spokane Indians minor league baseball team, right? And through their dialogues, they came to the realization, or they agreed that there's something good about this team name, Spokane Indians, right? One, it refers to the team, and the community loves their team. On the other hand, Spokane Indian also refers to the tribe, right? And the tribe kind of liked that as well. And so when they talked, they decided to redesign the uniforms of the team, right? And so now the team's uniforms are written in Spokane, right? They're written in a Salish script, right? To say Spokane Indians, right? And so you have this convergence in which particular kind of visibility and identity for the tribe matched with the identity and visibility of a team and community, right? And to me, was a really positive, productive place in which respect and sovereignty is going both ways.
Well, I appreciate all of this, and truly well spoken and well put, and illuminating for me. But I hope to continue to be more increasingly knowledgeable about this. And frankly, this is like a lot of things these days. This is one of a number of very significant moments in time, right? This is the documentary footage is being created now, for the generations to come. Give our audiences an update on this current book that you have. You've got a few other ones out there. I noticed the Team Spirits one as well. But tell us about the book currently, and maybe what else you might have percolating in and around it, especially given the acuteness now. This is after 4 or 5 years of your book coming out, right? Right.
So my book is an effort to understand the origins of the DC football team and how over time it became a symbolic nexus and a commercial brand. And to sort of say, how did this take shape, and why over 50 years after Native Americans began protesting, has it not changed? Right? And to explore questions, I have a chapter in there on, for example, on sentimentality. I have a chapter in there on entitlements and appropriation. I have a chapter thinking about what does it mean if we just change, if we just get rid of this team name and all the other mascots stay the same, does that make a difference? What kind of difference does it make? My greatest fear has always been that we would change the DC football team name, and everybody else would go on as if nothing had happened, right? And we wouldn't really engage the histories and the legacies, right? I don't yet have a new book, but I do have several articles and chapters towards a book that are thinking about really some of the complications or complicated ways that Indian mascots travel, right? For example, why are there Native American mascots in Europe? And how are they different? How do they work differently than mascots here? What does it mean? Or how has the controversy played out in a Canadian kind of context? And also thinking about other kinds of mascots that we don't think about that really are reflective of, I guess, the broader history of America, right? I mean, what does it mean to have a team called the Cowboys? How's that team been represented over time? Or what does it mean to have a team called the Patriots, right? In which clearly Indianness is not the issue, but there's some history that's being harnessed and glossed over there that's worth thinking about, right? So I'm still thinking about the stories that our symbols tell.
All right. Our thanks to the professor. I think this is a fascinating topic, an important one. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. I encourage you to keep abreast of not only this situation, and as we will, and there will be other conversations, I think, to be had, and we are more than happy to continue to have them as they relate to perhaps other teams and situations and leagues or whatever who might come to the realization that the nicknames, if you will, and the misunderstandings or the misappropriations of those heritages of the past do not square with the realities of today and the future. The book, again, is called Redskins, Insult and Brand. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. It is a very accessible read. I think it's well worth your time. It will open your eyes, and it's not just, frankly, like I said before, about the Washington situation, but if you're a fan of the Cleveland Indians or the Chicago Blackhawks or the Atlanta Braves, or any of the other teams in the realms of Native American nicknames. But also just generally, there are a lot of other marginalized communities out there beyond even just that, and that arguably have nicknames that have been similarly misappropriated. I think we're in an important time right now where we can feel comfortable in opening up the conversation around all of those situations and, frankly, right some of the wrongs that have been long festering and have been either ignored or pushed back, or worse, as Rich and I talked about, have been economically derailed because these are big businesses and logos now, and that's not an excuse. As a matter of fact, it makes it worse, we would think. So, whether you're a fan of the Washington NFL franchise or not, and or don't fully sort of grasp why all of a sudden it seems now that the team nickname is changing, I would argue that if that's your situation, there are views to be made now, because how that team goes forward and how its history looks and how it encompasses and perhaps collegially and complementarily works with the Native American community, perhaps to more rightly remember that history and celebrate it in an appropriate way. I think the time to help that process is now. It is uncertain whether the current franchise will be capable of doing it properly. I mean, I think, eliminating the name now as an immediate move is smart, but there's a lot more that has to now follow through, and the time where that follow through is going to be defined is now. So if you're upset about it and want to make it right, now is the time to kind of jump in and try to make it right and help perhaps that organization do so. Okay, I'm done preaching, but I appreciate your listening. This is just one of many, many, many topics, and we do get frivolous. So don't worry, friends. We're not going to get all sober on you every single week, but when we need to, we will, as we did this week. Let's see. How about social media? Yes, why not follow us on social media? Why don't you? We're on Twitter at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You will find a Facebook page devoted to us, too. Just search up Good Seats Still Available. You'll find that there. Our website, of course, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where all of our old episodes can be found. You can share them and download them, stream them, do whatever you want. You can also find our email link there, but you can also do that directly at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And, of course, while you're on the website, just search around. There is a little newsletter that you can subscribe to, too, and we give you a little tip sheet on what we're going to be talking about that coming week. Just enter in your email address and push send, and you will be added to our little insider list. Pretty simple to do. Thank you, of course, to our pal Jerry Payne down in Metro Atlanta. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. Again, Audio Excellence was delivered this week. We appreciate his efforts as we do each and every week, and he's been with us since the beginning. So a hearty, renewed thanks again for sticking with us all this time, too. And thank you, our great listeners, for sticking with us. We continue to add new listeners to the pile each and every week. We are in the hundreds of thousands of listeners and shows and all that kind of stuff, and it's fantastic. There's seemingly no place on the planet that we haven't yet touched, with the possible exception of Antarctica. But I'm not sure that the servers there accurately represent any downloads that might be occurring there. But suffice to say, 6 continents for sure. And we just love all your input. We appreciate your passion and your suggestions, and plenty more good stuff to come, and a little bit more frivolous and more fun for sure. But again, those sober and topics and those important topics too, we won't shy away from those either. And we appreciate your giving a listen for this week and all weeks as we bid you a fond adieu. Thanks again for your listenership, and we'll see you next week. God willing, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.